Serafina Gable had always known the land would shape her fate, but nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. The dust of the Montana Territory was a constant presence, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything. A reminder that this was a place where things came not to grow, but to be broken down. It settled in the lines of her face, in the folds of her worn dress, and in the deep, quiet corners of her soul where hope had long since turned to ash. Today, that dust tasted of humiliation, churned by the boots of a town that had gathered for its monthly spectacle of misery. Redemption. Gulch was a town carved from rock and desperation, a place that clung to the side of a barren canyon like a stubborn weed. The ghost of a failed silver mine haunted its very foundations, its skeletal headframe a constant silhouette against the unforgiving sky. The town smelled of stale whiskey, horse manure, and the faint, metallic scent of blood that never quite washed away from the saloon floorboards. It was a town governed not by law, but by the whims of one man, Warden Thaddeus Crow. Crow was a man whose shadow fell long and cold even under the midday sun. He had arrived a decade ago, not with a prospector's pickaxe, but with a fat leather satchel full of legal papers and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had bought the town's debt from a collapsed bank back east, effectively becoming the owner of every plot of land, every failing business, every desperate soul. He slowly wrapped his influence around the town's throat until it could no longer breathe without his permission. His power was absolute, cemented each month by a cruel tradition he called the Settler's Auction. It was a marketplace for broken lives, a stage where debts were settled not with coin, but with flesh and bone. And Crow was its undisputed master of ceremonies. The auction was held in the town square, a patch of hard-packed earth that had witnessed more sorrow than a battlefield. On a raised platform before the saloon, Crow presided over the proceedings, his bulk squeezed into a tailored city coat that seemed out of place against the raw timber and faded paint of the frontier. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a well-fed bear, but his eyes missed nothing. Below him, a small group of women stood in a line, their gazes fixed on the ground, each one a story of loss and misfortune. They were widows whose husbands had perished in the mine, orphans whose parents had succumbed to winter fever, and outcasts who had nowhere else to go. They were all swept up by Crow's network and offered up as chattel. But Serafina was always set apart, a special kind of spectacle. Bound in heavy chains that scraped against the dry earth. She was the final act, the punchline to Crow's cruel joke. Rumors clung to her like her ragged dress. Some whispered she was the educated daughter of an Eastern abolitionist, captured by raiders, a past that made her both an object of scorn and a dangerous anomaly in this harsh land. She was the living embodiment of worthlessness in a town that worshipped brute strength and simple survival. From the edge of the crowd, Elias Thorne watched the scene unfold, a familiar bitterness rising in his throat. The world had taken everything from him, his wife. Sarah, with her laughter like wind chimes. His son, little Caleb, with his bright, curious eyes, and now it was coming for the land. He could still see them in the shimmering heat haze, ghosts of a life that felt like it belonged to another man. His farm, a stretch of stubborn soil that had been in his family for 2 generations, was all he had left, a monument to his failure. A series of bad harvests, a brutal winter, and the ever-present weight of grief had pushed him to the brink. He had made a deal with the devil, and Thaddeus Crow had come to collect. The deed to his land sat in the warden's safe, a hostage against a debt that grew larger with every passing day. A debt Crow had no intention of letting him repay. Crow's gaze swept over the crowd, a predator scanning his domain, his eyes small and dark like chips of obsidian. Found Elias, and a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. He enjoyed these moments, the public breaking of a man, far more than any silver the mountain had ever offered. He raised a hand, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Elias Thorne. He boomed, his voice echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. A man of sorrow, a man of debt, a man whose land bleeds dust, much like his spirit. Laughter rippled through the onlookers, a harsh, ugly sound. Elias stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He felt the eyes of the town on him, 100 points of judgment and morbid curiosity. He could feel their pity, and it burned worse than their scorn. The warden let the humiliation hang in the air, letting it steep like bitter tea before continuing. "But I am a generous man," Crow declared, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "I understand the plight of the desperate." He gestured toward the line of women, then let his finger drift with theatrical slowness until it pointed directly at Seraphina. "Your debt is considerable, Thorn, but I will offer you a bargain." He paused for dramatic effect, savoring the control he held over every soul in the square. "You may take that one," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "The chained girl, Seraphina, take her for free. No coin down." A wave of confusion and cruel amusement washed over the crowd. To be given the most broken thing on the block was not an act of charity, it was a deeper, more profound insult. It was a yoke, another burden designed to ensure his failure. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He knew this was a trap, another turn of the screw in his slow, agonizing crucifixion. However, Crow's voice cut through the noise. "Sharp and final, there are conditions." He began to lay out the terms of his impossible wager, each word a nail in Elias's coffin. "You have 1 year, 12 months to turn that barren patch of yours into a profitable enterprise. You will not only clear your existing debt, but you will pay me an additional $500 a fee for my generosity." The crowd gasped. $500 was a fortune, an amount no small farmer in the territory could hope to see in 5 years, let alone 1. It was a king's ransom built on a pauper's back. "And the girl," Crow added, his eyes glinting with a possessive fire. "She will be the collateral. If you fail, at the end of that year, I will take your land, as is my right, and I will take her back, as she is my property to reclaim." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The terms were not just impossible, they were a death sentence, a guarantee of failure designed to utterly destroy what little remained of Elias Thorn. He would lose his land, his legacy, and be forced to return this woman to a fate worse than the one she already endured. The crowd watched, holding its collective breath, waiting for him to crumble, to refuse, to walk away in defeat. They expected him to break, because that is what men did in Redemption Gulch. They broke. But as Elias looked at Seraphina, standing alone in her chains, her head bowed but her shoulders unbent, he saw something else in the dirt at her feet. He saw the graves of his wife and son, in the glint of Crow's eyes. He saw the face of every misfortune that had ever befallen him, and in the quiet, stoic defiance of the woman in chains, he saw the reflection of his own brokenness, his own stubborn refusal to completely surrender, for the first time in years. A flicker of something other than grief stirred within him. It was not hope, it was rage, a cold, quiet rage that burned away the despair. Leaving behind a hard, unyielding core, he had nothing left to lose, and in that, he found a strange and terrible freedom. He lifted his head, his gaze meeting Crow's across the square. The warden's smile was triumphant, expectant. Slowly, deliberately, Elias Thorn took a step forward. The crowd shifted, a collective sigh of anticipation. And then another step. He walked through the parted onlookers, who drew back as if he were a leper or a ghost. He walked until he stood before the platform, his shadow merging with Seraphina's in the long afternoon light. He looked up at the man who had orchestrated his ruin, the man who held all the power. And in a voice that was low, steady, and devoid of all emotion, he spoke a single word that sealed his fate, and hers. The ride from Redemption Gulch to the Thorn homestead was a journey through a landscape of silence. The wagon wheels groaned in protest against the rutted track, a lonely sound in the vast, indifferent expanse of the territory. Elias sat rigid on the driver's bench, his knuckles white on the reins, his gaze fixed on the dusty horizon as if he could will the farm to disappear before they arrived. Beside him, Seraphina sat as still as a statue, the weight of the chains on her wrists a cold. Heavy reality, the deal was done, the words spoken, and now the consequences began to unfold, one agonizing mile at a time. The sun beat down, baking the earth and leaching the color from the sky, mirroring the emptiness that had taken root in Elias's soul. This was not a rescue, it was the start of a sentence, and they were both its prisoners. The farm appeared first as a dark smudge against the pale grass, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the elements. As they drew closer, the full scope of its decay became apparent. The fences sagged, the barn door hung crooked on a single hinge, and the fields lay fallow, choked with weeds. It was a place where hope had died, and Elias was its solitary groundskeeper. He pulled the wagon to a halt in the yard, the silence pressing in, broken only by the tired sigh of the horses. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He was a man returning to his tomb, and he had brought a stranger with him, with a heavy, deliberate motion. He dismounted and walked to the back of the wagon, retrieving a set of keys from his pocket, the keys Crow's deputy had tossed him with a sneer. The click of the lock opening was unnaturally loud in the quiet yard. As the shackles fell away from Seraphina's wrists, she did not rub them or cry out, she simply lowered her hands to her lap, her face an unreadable mask. Red, raw circles marked her skin, a testament to months of bondage. The first act of their new life together was an undoing, a release that felt less like freedom and more like the changing of guards. Elias avoided her eyes, his touch purely functional as he helped her down from the wagon. He felt a flicker of something pity, perhaps, or a shared sense of degradation, but he crushed it instantly. Pity was a luxury he could not afford. She was a tool, a component in Crow's cruel equation, and he had to treat her as such, lest he forget the impossible price of their arrangement. The farmhouse was as cold and hollow as the man who lived in it. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating a space stripped bare of warmth and comfort. The furniture was sparse and practical, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cold stove. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no sign that a woman's touch had ever graced these walls. The ghost of his wife, Sarah, was everywhere and nowhere at once. He could almost see her by the stove, humming a soft tune, but the vision would dissolve into the empty air, leaving only a deeper ache in his chest. He showed Seraphina to a small, stark room at the back of the house, furnished with little more than a narrow cot. He left her there without a word, closing the door behind him, creating a physical barrier to match the emotional one he had already erected. Days bled into one another in a haze of cautious routine and unspoken suspicion. Elias rose before the sun, the weight of his impossible task driving him from his bed. He set Seraphina to the most grueling chores he could devise, a silent, relentless test of her endurance. He had her mend the miles of broken fences under the brutal sun, clear the rock-strewn fields until her hands were raw, and haul water from the well until her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He watched her from a distance, a silent observer, expecting her to break, to complain, to give him a reason to confirm his belief that she was nothing more than a burden. But she did none of those things. She worked with a quiet, methodical efficiency that unnerved him. She never met his gaze, never spoke unless spoken to, and moved through her tasks with a grim determination that mirrored his own. Seraphina, for her part, understood the nature of this test. She had been surviving tests like this her entire life. She kept her head down, her movements deliberate, carefully concealing the sharp, analytical mind that worked tirelessly behind her placid expression. She knew that to reveal her intelligence, to show the education her father had so lovingly bestowed upon her, would be a fatal mistake in this world that equated knowledge in a woman with witchcraft or deceit. So she played the part assigned to her, pretending not to understand the mechanics of a plow, feigning difficulty with simple knots, all while her mind calculated crop yields, assessed soil quality, and cataloged the farm's every weakness. She was a prisoner playing the role of a simpleton, and every day was a performance for an audience of one. Their fragile, silent world was first pierced by the arrival of Beatrice B. Galloway. She appeared one afternoon in a sturdy buckboard wagon, a stout, kind-faced widow whose eyes held a sorrow that recognized the same in others. Her husband had been one of the many men swallowed by the failed silver mine, a tragedy that had left her isolated but not broken. She was one of the few souls in Redemption Gulch who operated outside of Crow's sphere of fear. She brought with her a sack of flour, a basket of fresh eggs, and a quiet strength that seemed to push back against the oppressive atmosphere of the farm. She spoke to Elias with a gentle familiarity, her words a balm on his raw nerves. and she looked at Seraphina not with pity or scorn, but with a simple, profound human decency. Bee's visits became a weekly ritual, a thin thread of connection to a world beyond their self-imposed exile. She would share news from town, her voice low as she spoke of Crow's tightening grip, of other families pushed to the brink. She never spoke of her own past, but there was a hard, knowing edge in her eyes whenever the warden's name was mentioned. A hint of a deeper, more personal history with the man's cruelty. Her presence was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration that not all of Redemption Gulch had surrendered its soul. For Seraphina, Bee's visits were a lifeline, a reminder that kindness still existed, however rare and fleeting. For Elias, they were a complication, a crack in the wall of his isolation that let in a sliver of unwelcome light. The turning point came as the summer heat reached its zenith. When the very air seemed to shimmer and the earth cracked with thirst, the farm's old water pump, its one source of life, began to falter. Its handle grew stiff, its groans more pronounced, until one sweltering afternoon, it gave a final metallic screech and seized completely. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Without water, the few struggling vegetables in their garden would wither, the livestock would perish, and the farm would die. The one-year clock Crow had set was ticking, and they had just lost their most vital tool. For 2 days, Elias fought the pump with a desperate fury. He was a man of the land, accustomed to solving problems with muscle and sweat. He dismantled it, piece by piece, laying the rusted components out on a dusty canvas. He cleaned them, oiled them, and reassembled them, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. The handle remained frozen, an immovable monument to his powerlessness. His rage grew until it was a palpable thing, a storm cloud hanging over the farm. He cursed the pump, he cursed the land, he cursed the God who had abandoned him. He was breaking, not against Crow's public spectacle, but against a simple piece of uncooperative iron. Seraphina watched him from the doorway of the farmhouse, a silent observer of his struggle. She had seen this before, in her father's study. When a complex clock mechanism had failed, she remembered him explaining the principles of leverage and fulcrums, the simple physics that governed the world. She saw the problem not as Elias did a battle of will, but as a simple, logical puzzle. The main pivot pin had swollen with rust and heat. Wedging itself tight within its housing, brute force would only make it worse. On the third day, as Elias slumped against the well in defeated exhaustion, she approached. She carried a small can of lard and a heavy mallet. She did not speak, did not offer advice. She simply knelt beside the pump's mechanism. Elias watched her through narrowed, suspicious eyes, too tired to protest, with delicate, precise movements. She packed the lard around the seized pin, then began to tap the housing with the mallet, not with force, but with a steady, rhythmic cadence. Tap, 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 the vibrations, she knew, would slowly work the grease into the microscopic fissures in the rust, for what felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the pin shifted, almost imperceptibly. She continued her rhythmic tapping, and slowly, agonizingly, the mechanism began to yield. She placed her hands on the handle, put her weight into it, and with a final, shuddering screech, it moved. Water, cool and life-giving, gushed from the spout. Elias stared, first at the water pooling in the dust, then at the woman kneeling by the well. It wasn't magic, it was knowledge. He had spent 2 days fighting the pump with his strength and had failed. She had defeated it in under an hour with her mind. In that moment, his perception of her shifted irrevocably. The carefully constructed image of the simple, broken thing shattered, and in its place stood someone else entirely. She was not a burden. She was not a tool. She was a survivor, armed with a quiet intelligence that was more powerful than any man's fury. The seed of respect, hard and unexpected, had been planted in the barren soil of his heart. The water from the newly repaired pump was more than just a cure for the thirsty land. It was a current that shifted the very ground between Elias and Seraphina. The respect that had taken root in Elias's heart was a strange and unfamiliar sensation. It did not manifest in words. Words were a currency long devalued on this silent homestead, but in actions. He no longer set her to the most back-breaking tasks as a test of her limits. Instead, he began to work alongside her, a silent partner in a shared struggle. When he saw her struggling to lift a heavy fence post, he would appear at her side and take the weight without a word. When he repaired the plow, he found himself explaining the mechanics of it, not to a subordinate, but to an equal, his voice rough from disuse. A fragile trust began to form in the spaces between them, a delicate thing woven from shared labor and mutual observation. Seeing the change in him, Serafina cautiously began to let the mask of the simpleton slip. Not all at once, but in small, calculated increments. She started with the earth itself, using a stick to draw in the dirt. She laid out a plan for crop rotation, a concept utterly foreign to the boom-and-bust farming of the territory. She explained, in simple, practical terms, how planting beans in the fallow field would return life to the soil that corn had stripped away. Elias listened, his initial skepticism warring with the undeniable logic of her proposal. He had seen the land die a little more each year under his own methods. He had nothing to lose by trying hers. Her intelligence began to seep into every corner of their existence. She devised a system of ditches to channel the precious water from the pump, maximizing its reach and minimizing waste. She showed him how to build better snares to catch rabbits and quail, supplementing their meager diet. At night, by the dim light of a single candle, she would take a piece of charcoal and work on the back of an old piece of parchment, calculating their potential yield, their expenses, the razor-thin margin that stood between them and ruin. Elias would watch her, a silent awe growing within him. This woman, whom he had accepted as a burden, was methodically, brilliantly, planning their salvation. The farmhouse, once a tomb of grief, began to feel like a command post in a quiet war for survival. But their small, budding success did not go unnoticed. Redemption Gulch was a town of whispers, and Warden Crow had ears everywhere. Word of the Thorn homestead's unlikely revival reached him, carried on the bitter winds of gossip. The news that the broken man and the worthless girl were not just surviving, but beginning to build something, was an intolerable act of defiance. Crow's power was built on the certainty of failure, on the belief that hope was a fool's game. Elias and Serafina's quiet resilience was a threat to that foundation. His generosity had been a carefully crafted trap, and they were refusing to spring it. His frustration curdled into a cold, focused rage. He summoned his most trusted instrument of cruelty, a hulking brute of a man named Rory Rock Hatcher. The sabotage that followed was of a different nature. It was no longer the subtle hand of misfortune, but the heavy fist of malice. One morning, they awoke to find their small flock of chickens slaughtered, their bodies left in a gruesome pile. A few nights later, a section of their newly mended fence was torn down, and their only cow was driven off into the wilderness. The most vicious attack came when Elias discovered the well water had a strange, oily sheen. Serafina, recognizing the smell of lye, stopped him just before he drank. Someone had tried to poison them. The farm was no longer just a challenge. It had become a battlefield. The pressure was immense, a constant, gnawing fear that sleep offered no escape from. Instead of breaking them apart, the escalating terror forged them together. They became a single unit, their movements synchronized by a shared purpose. They took turns standing watch at night, a rifle resting across their laps as they stared into the oppressive darkness. Serafina, using her knowledge of mechanics, devised a series of simple alarms tripwires connected to a string of empty tin cans that would alert them to any intruder. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a cruel contract. They were soldiers holding a besieged fort, and their shared enemy gave their partnership a strength that affection never could have. They were a team, bound by the grim reality that if one of them fell, the other would surely follow. Autumn arrived, painting the distant hills in hues of gold and rust. It was the season of harvest, the culmination of all their labor, their one and only chance to meet Crow's impossible demand. The fields, once barren, were now heavy with corn and beans. A small, fragile sense of hope, something neither of them had dared to feel, began to bloom amidst the fear. They had done it, against all odds. They had bent the land to their will. The harvest would be enough. just enough to pay the debt and secure their future. They worked from dawn until dusk, gathering the fruits of their labor, their movements filled with a new, urgent energy. It was on a moonless night, with the last of the harvest safely stored in the barn, that the final blow fell. They were jolted from a light, restless sleep by a terrifying sound, the frantic, panicked cries of their livestock. Elias was the first one out the door, his heart pounding in his chest. A hellish orange glow was blooming against the black sky, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the yard. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry timber walls, roaring into the night like a hungry beast. Rock Hatcher and his men had returned, not to steal or to poison, but to burn everything to the ground. All their work, their hope, their entire future, was turning to ash before their eyes. Primal instinct took over Elias. He grabbed an axe and, without a thought for his own safety, charged toward the inferno. The animals, their horse, their cow, the few pigs they owned were trapped inside. He smashed the lock on the main door and plunged into the choking smoke and searing heat. One by one, he drove the terrified animals out into the yard, but as he went back in for the last piglet, a deafening crack echoed above the roar of the flames. A massive support beam, eaten through by the fire, splintered and collapsed. It fell across Elias's back, pinning him to the ground with an explosion of sparks and burning timber. A scream of pure agony was ripped from his throat before the smoke and pain consumed him. From the edge of the yard, Seraphina saw it all. In that instant, every shred of her carefully constructed facade was incinerated. The simpleton, the survivor, the woman who hid her mind to protect her life, all of it vanished. What remained was a core of pure, unyielding will. She ran toward the flames, not away from them. She ignored the blistering heat that scorched her skin and the thick smoke that clawed at her lungs. She found Elias, half conscious, pinned beneath the burning weight of the beam. With a strength born of sheer desperation, she used a smaller, unbroken plank as a lever, straining with every fiber of her being until the massive timber shifted just enough for her to drag him, inch by agonizing inch, out of the collapsing barn and into the relative safety of the yard. The danger was not over. Elias was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and ragged, and the smell of burnt flesh hung in the air. The woman who had feigned ignorance of simple knots now moved with the swift, practiced confidence of a seasoned doctor. Her mind, so long suppressed, raced with clinical precision. She ripped strips from the hem of her own dress to create clean bandages. She saw the unnatural angle of his leg and knew it was broken. Shouting instructions to a stunned B. Galloway, who had seen the blaze from her own farm and rushed to help, she directed her to fetch clean water and specific herbs from a small medicinal patch she had cultivated in secret. As B ran to obey, Seraphina found 2 sturdy pieces of planking and, using the torn cloth, expertly fashioned a splint, immobilizing his shattered leg. She cleaned his burns, her touch gentle but firm, applying a poultice of crushed leaves to ward off infection. Her cover was not just broken, it was utterly and irrevocably destroyed, consumed by the same flames that had taken their barn, in the flickering, hellish light of the fire, kneeling over the broken body of the man she had saved. The true Seraphina Gable was finally, terrifyingly, revealed. The world returned to Elias Thorne in fragments of pain and fire. He drifted in a feverish haze, a realm where the inferno's roar still echoed in his ears and the phantom weight of the burning beam pressed down on his soul. Through the fog, he saw a face, framed by the flickering, hellish light of the dying flames. It was Seraphina, but not the silent, subservient woman he had known. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a fierce, focused intensity he had never seen before. Her hands, which he had only known to be calloused from labor, moved with a gentle, unerring precision as they tended to his wounds. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the hesitant murmur he was accustomed to, but a clear, commanding tone that cut through his delirium. Directing a frantic B. Galloway with an authority that was absolute. He was a broken man, adrift in a sea of agony, and she was his anchor. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing crawl back to the light. The farmhouse, once a place of silent suspicion, transformed into a makeshift infirmary. Serafina became its tireless warden. She never seemed to sleep, her presence a constant, watchful shadow in the dim room. She changed his bandages, forced bitter, healing teas between his lips, and checked the splint on his shattered leg with a clinical eye. The pain was a constant, ravenous beast, but her quiet competence was a shield against it. Elias, trapped in the prison of his own body, could do nothing but watch. He saw the deep, calculating intelligence in her eyes as she assessed his condition, the vast, hidden well of knowledge from which she drew. The woman who had fixed his water pump with simple physics was now saving his life with complex medicine. The last vestiges of his pride, his foolish notion that he was the master of this arrangement, crumbled into dust. He was utterly, completely, in her debt. As Elias's body slowly began to mend, a new and more urgent battle began. The fire had taken everything, their harvest, their tools, their barn, all of it was gone. The clock on Crow's deal had not stopped ticking. Ruin was no longer a distant threat. It was a certainty. Waiting for them at the end of the year, despair, a familiar old enemy, began to creep back into the corners of the farmhouse. But this time, it was met with a formidable opponent. Serafina was no longer just a survivor, she was a commander. The fire had burned away her camouflage, and she had no intention of putting it back on. With Elias confined to his bed, the full weight of their survival now rested on her shoulders, and she bore it with a strength that astounded him. Her first move was to confront the past. She sat with B. Galloway at the rough-hewn table, the widow's face etched with a grief that the fire had rekindled. Serafina's voice was soft, but her question was direct. She asked B about her husband, about the circumstances of his death, about the work he had done for Warden Crow before the mining accident that had claimed his life. Hesitantly at first, then with a torrent of long-suppressed sorrow, B spoke. She told of a good man who had become entangled with the devil, a bookkeeper who had seen too much. She spoke of his growing fear, of the late nights he spent poring over ledgers, his face pale with a terrible knowledge, and she spoke of a small, locked chest he had hidden beneath the floorboards of their home, a chest he had told her to guard with her life. That evening, under the cover of darkness, the two women retrieved the chest. It contained a single, thick, leather-bound ledger as Serafina opened it, the pages brittle with age. She knew she was holding the key. The book was filled with B's husband's meticulous script. But it was not a simple accounting of profits and losses. It was a coded diary of a criminal empire. Night after night, Serafina and B worked by candlelight, their heads bent over the cryptic entries. Serafina's mind, honed by years of formal education, deciphered the code. Shipments of cattle corresponded with dates when young women had disappeared from the territory. Land acquisition fees were linked to the names of families who had been mysteriously driven from their homes. It was all there, a horrifying tapestry of land fraud, extortion, and human trafficking, all orchestrated by Warden Crow. The most damning revelation was the last entry, a frantic, unfinished scrawl detailing how Crow had deliberately caused the mine collapse to silence B's husband and the other men who had discovered his secret. He hadn't just been a victim of an accident, he had been murdered. As they uncovered the truth, a palpable sense of danger settled over the farmhouse. They were no longer just fighting for a piece of land. They were in possession of a secret that could get them killed. Crow, sensing that the fire had not broken them as he intended, began to tighten the noose. He made a visit to the farm, his face a mask of false sympathy. He looked at the smoldering ruins of the barn, at the injured Elias, and then at Serafina. His eyes lingered on her, and for the first time, he saw not a worthless girl, but a threat. He saw the defiance in her posture, the intelligence in her gaze. He realized his mistake. He had underestimated her, and that was a mistake he could not afford. He left with a veiled threat, a reminder that the year was drawing to a close and that debts would be paid, one way or another. Crow knew he could not wait. The woman was too smart, too resilient. He had to crush them now, before she could find a way to use her mind against him. He decided to move up his timeline, to use the very law he so often twisted to his own ends. He posted a notice in the town square, announcing a public tribunal to be held in 1 week's time. The official purpose was to adjudicate the terms of Elias Thorne's contract, citing the destruction of the farm's assets as a breach. It was a legal pretext, a show trial designed for one purpose: to publicly and officially strip Elias of his land and reclaim Serafina, silencing her for good. The news, delivered by a grim-faced bee, was a death sentence. But as she looked at the notice, Serafina did not see a trap. She saw an opportunity. Crow had just handed her a weapon, a public stage. The battle would no longer be fought in the shadows, on a besieged farm. It would be fought in the heart of his own territory, before the very people he had oppressed for so long. The final confrontation was coming. The day of the tribunal, the saloon was packed to the rafters. The entire town of Redemption Gulch had turned out, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and fear. Crow sat at a makeshift judge's bench, a picture of smug authority. He laid out his case with theatrical precision, painting Elias as a failure and himself as a benevolent benefactor whose trust had been betrayed. He was in complete control, the master of his domain. Then, the saloon doors swung open. Serafina entered, not as a chained girl but as a woman walking to a battle she had chosen. Beside her, leaning heavily on a crutch but with his head held high, was Elias, and behind them, her face set with a grim resolve, was Bee Galloway, clutching a leather-bound ledger to her chest. When Crow called on them to speak, Serafina stepped forward, but she did not address him. She turned and faced the silent, watching crowd. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the room. She did not plead for mercy. She did not argue the terms of the contract. Instead, she began to tell a story. She told the story of Bee's husband and the other men who died in the mine. She told the story of families who had lost their land, of daughters who had vanished without a trace. And then she opened the ledger. She read the names. She read the dates. She laid bare the cold, hard facts of Crow's reign of terror. She connected his wealth to their poverty, his power to their suffering. She turned his show trial into a trial of his own making. And the silent, fearful townspeople were now his jury. The ground was shifting, and the devil of Redemption Gulch was about to face his judgment. For a long, suspended moment after Serafina's voice fell silent, the only sound in the saloon was the frantic beating of 100 hearts. The air was thick with revelation, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken truths now laid bare. The townspeople looked not at Serafina, but at each other, seeing their own private sorrows reflected in their neighbors' eyes. The farmer whose well had mysteriously run dry, the widow whose daughter had been sent away for work and never heard from again, the miner who had lost his claim in a crooked card game. They were all there, pieces of a puzzle that had finally been assembled. Serafina had not just told a story, she had given their collective pain a name, and that name was Thaddeus Crow. Crow's face, which had been a mask of smug authority, had contorted into a snarl of pure fury. The theatrical performance was over. The predator was revealed. "Lies!" he roared, his voice cracking. He slammed his fist on the makeshift bench, a futile attempt to command an authority that was already bleeding away. She is a witch, a charlatan, trying to save her own skin with fabricated tales. He pointed a trembling finger at Serafina. "Rock sees her, sees them all." Rory Rock Hatcher, his face a dull red with confusion and rage. Moved to obey, he was a man who understood only the simple language of violence, and his master had given him an order. He took a heavy step toward Serafina, his massive hands reaching for her. But before he could touch her, a figure stepped into his path. It was the town blacksmith, a quiet, hulking man whose arms were thick as tree limbs from a lifetime at the forge. He had lost his younger brother in the mine collapse. He said nothing. He simply stood there, a wall of muscle and grief, and met Rock's advance with an unblinking stare. That single, silent act of defiance was the spark that lit the fuse. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, growing into a growl, then a roar of collective rage. The fear that had held Redemption Gulch in its icy grip for a decade shattered like glass. It was not a calculated rebellion. It was a primal, visceral eruption of long-suppressed fury. Men who had averted their eyes from Crow for years now met his gaze with open hatred. Women who had whispered in fear now shouted his crimes aloud. The saloon, which had been his stage, became a cage. The ensuing chaos was not a battle, it was a judgment. Rockhatcher threw a clumsy punch at the blacksmith, who absorbed the blow and answered with a single, devastating strike that sent the brute crashing to the floor. Crow's other cronies, seeing their leader's power evaporate, tried to flee, only to be swallowed by the tide of angry townspeople. It was a messy, desperate, and deeply personal uprising. Fists flew, tables were overturned, and the air filled with the sounds of splintering wood and righteous fury. Through it all, Elias stood his ground, his crutch planted firmly, his body a shield in front of Seraphina and Bee, his face a mask of grim determination. Warden Crow, for the first time in his life, knew true fear. He scrambled back from his bench, his eyes wide with disbelief, searching for an escape that did not exist. He was cornered by the very people he had dismissed as sheep. They closed in on him, not as a mob, but as individual accusers. A woman held up a faded photograph of her missing daughter, her voice choked with sobs. An old man pointed a gnarled finger, accusing Crow of stealing the land his father had homesteaded. They were the ghosts of his crimes, returned to claim their due. He was not taken down by a single hero, but overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing weight of his own sins. They bound his hands with the cord from the saloon's velvet curtains, the symbol of his stolen luxury, now the instrument of his capture. The devil of redemption. Gulch was a devil no more, he was just a man, terrified and defeated. As the chaos subsided, a strange, sober silence descended upon the room. The townspeople looked at the bound and bleeding figures of Crow and his men, then at each other, as if waking from a long nightmare. They had done the unthinkable. They had torn down their king. In the center of it all stood Seraphina, Elias, and Bee, the unlikely architects of this new, uncertain dawn. The journey back to the Thorn homestead was surreal. The world outside the saloon was unchanged. The sun still hung in the vast, indifferent sky. The wind still whispered through the dry grass, but everything was different. The silence in the wagon was no longer one of suspicion or fear, but of shared exhaustion and a profound, unspoken understanding. They had walked through the fire together, and the world on the other side was a place they would have to build themselves. Back at the farm, amidst the charred ruins of the barn, the weight of the day finally settled upon them. Bee, her face a mixture of grief and grim satisfaction, eventually departed for her own home, leaving Elias and Seraphina alone in the twilight. He stood leaning on his crutch, looking at the black skeleton of the building that had represented his entire future. It was all gone. And yet, for the first time since his family had died, he did not feel the crushing weight of despair. He turned to Seraphina, who was watching him, her face illuminated by the soft, fading light. There were no words for what passed between them. Gratitude was too small a word for the life she had given back to him. Admiration was insufficient for the courage he had witnessed. He simply reached out, his hand calloused and scarred, and gently took hers. Her fingers, slender but strong, curled around his. It was the first time they had touched not out of necessity, but out of a shared humanity. In her eyes, he saw not a victim, but the woman who had faced down a tyrant and won. And in his, she saw not the broken, grieving man he had been, but the quiet, resilient man who had stood by her side, ready to defend her to the last. They had saved each other, and in the ruins of their old life, a new and unspoken promise was made. A few days later, a small delegation from the town arrived at the farm. It was the blacksmith, the stable owner, and a few other respected elders. They came not with demands, but with a heavy sense of purpose. They stood before Bee Galloway, who had joined Elias and Seraphina in the yard, and they made a request. They asked her, the woman whose husband's legacy had been the catalyst for their liberation, to lead them. They proposed the formation of a temporary town council, a body of the people, for the people, to restore order and build a just future. They were no longer waiting for salvation from a distant government. They were claiming their own. Bee, her eyes filled with the weight of this new responsibility, looked at Seraphina and Elias, saw their quiet nod of support, and accepted. The judgment of the town was complete. The long, slow work of recovery had just begun. A year passed, marked not by the turning of a calendar page, but by the slow, steady healing of the land and its people. The seasons turned over Redemption Gulch, washing away the dust of Thaddeus Crow's tyranny with the clean, hard rains of spring and the quiet, blanketing snows of winter. The fear that had been the town's lifeblood was gone, replaced by something quieter, more resilient, the sound of hammers on wood, the murmur of conversation in the general store, the laughter of children playing in a square that no longer served as a stage for humiliation. Under B. Galloway's steady guidance, the saloon itself was being transformed, its gaudy facade stripped away to become a proper town hall, a place for meetings and votes, not subjugation. The town was breathing again, its lungs filling with the air of a future it was building with its own hands. The Thorne homestead stood as a living testament to this rebirth. The charred skeleton of the old barn was gone, its blackened timbers salvaged and repurposed into fences and sheds. In its place stood a new structure, smaller but sturdier, its fresh pine scent a declaration of new beginnings. It had been raised in a single week by the collective effort of the townspeople, the blacksmith, the farmers, the miners, a barn built not of debt and obligation, but of gratitude and shared purpose. The fields around it were no longer a patchwork of weeds and dust. They were a vibrant tapestry of green and gold, heavy with corn, beans, and wheat, a testament to the knowledge Seraphina had shared and the hard labor Elias had invested. The farm was alive, its heartbeat steady and strong, the lowing of a healthy milk cow a gentle song in the evening air. But the most profound transformation had taken place in a section of the new barn, where the scent of hay and livestock mingled with the smell of chalk dust and old paper. Here, in a space walled off and filled with rough-hewn benches, Seraphina had built her school every morning. The children of Redemption Gulch, who had once known only the harsh lessons of survival, would gather. Their voices, once timid, now filled the air as they learned to trace the shapes of letters, to unlock the stories and ideas held within the pages of the few precious books Seraphina and Bay had gathered a tattered copy of Shakespeare, a farmer's almanac, a book of simple arithmetic. They were learning more than just reading and writing. They were learning that knowledge was not a dangerous secret, but a tool of liberation, a shield against the tyrants of the world. Seraphina moved among them not as a victim or a survivor, but as a nurturer. The quiet, watchful woman who had hidden her mind to stay alive now gave her knowledge freely, her voice a calm and patient guide. Watching her, one would never guess the fires she had walked through. The scars on her wrists had faded to pale, silvery lines, visible only to those who knew to look. They were a part of her, a map of her journey, but they no longer defined her. She had taken the worst of what the world had to offer and transformed it into a legacy of hope for a new generation. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. Elias, too, had been reborn. The angry, grief-stricken man who had accepted Crow's deal out of pure rage was gone. In his place was a man who had found a quiet peace. His leg had healed, leaving him with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night the old world had burned down. But the limp in his soul, the one that had crippled him for years, was gone. He worked the land now not with a desperate fury, but with a steady, knowing rhythm. Some evenings, he would walk to the two small graves on the hill behind the farmhouse, not with the heavy tread of sorrow, but with a lighter step. The ghosts of his wife and son were still with him, but they were no longer haunting specters. They were gentle memories, a part of the soil he tilled, a quiet strength that gave his labor a deeper meaning. He was no longer just holding on to the land. He was cultivating it, for the past he honored and the future he was building with Seraphina. Their love story was not one of grand declarations or passionate embraces. It was a quiet, deep-rooted thing, like the ancient cottonwoods that lined the creek. It was in the way he would leave a pail of fresh milk on the schoolhouse steps for her each morning. It was in the way she would save him a plate of warm food. No matter how late he came in from the fields, it was in the small, intricately carved wooden bird he left on her windowsill one day, a silent gift that spoke volumes. It was in the shared, unspoken understanding that passed between them in a single glance, a language forged in fire and silence, stronger than any vow. They were two broken halves who had found a way to become whole, not by fixing each other, but by standing together and building something new. The story ends on a warm afternoon in late summer, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the valley. From the fields, where he was sharpening the blade of his scythe for the coming harvest, Elias paused. He looked toward the barn, toward the open door of the schoolhouse. He could hear the faint murmur of children's voices reciting their letters, a sound that had become the farm's true anthem. In the doorway, he could see Seraphina's silhouette, her back to him as she pointed to something on a slate blackboard. The light caught the stray hairs that had escaped her bun, turning them into a golden halo, as if sensing his gaze. She turned. Her eyes met his across the yard, across the space that separated the world of the mind from the world of the soil. A slow, gentle smile spread across her face, a smile that held all the memory of their shared past, the dust, the chains, the fire, and all the promise of their shared future. Elias smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes and eased the weathered lines of his face. He raised a hand in a simple, quiet wave. She returned it. He then turned back to his work, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel resuming its steady, peaceful beat. She turned back to her students. They had not saved a kingdom or found a treasure. They had done something far more profound, from the ashes of their broken lives, on a small patch of unforgiving land. They had cultivated a harvest of hope, and they knew, with a quiet certainty, that it would be enough.